Post-colonial interpretation of Frankenstein.
What is colonialism?
And post-colonialism.
Colonialism is the notion that the racial other is seen as inferior. As a result, they are likely to be prevented from having a voice in literature. This attitude was largely confined to the time when the racial other was ruled by the West.
Postcolonialism is the notion that we see the racial other as similar to ourselves. It largely deals with the time period when the colonised are free and the colony has crumbled. Social
and historical context.
In the past, books helped to teach ideas of colonialism. For example, The Jungle Book, Tarzan and Aladdin, which all have characters depicted as savage.
In these books, there was a distinction between the colonised and the coloniser. The coloniser were repressed, civilised, had a voice, scientific, masculine, ordered and superior. This was in vast contrast to the colonised, who were sexual, threatening and violent, silent, natural, feminine, unruly and inferior. The British Empire was growing at the time of Frankenstein being published in 1818. It had control over many countries. This is why it played such a heavy role in the context of Frankenstein, and was such an important issue for Mary Shelley to discuss.
Audiences through time. In the 18th and 19th century, monsters were only put into stories to be got rid of, so that the main character would look like the hero. This is a common Gothic convention. Shelley rejects this idea by inviting some sympathy for the monster. However, at the time of its publishing, audiences may not have read Frankenstein this way. They may have taken the savage presentation of this monster as literal, which you can see in the top picture. It may not have been a criticism to the audiences, as this was still a colonial time period. However, as you can see in later times, the monster turned into a more literal monster figure, which is more of a horror convention than a Gothic convention. It is going from colonialism to a fright fest.
Modern audiences see the post-colonial criticism of British society and its empire that is present in Frankenstein more than in the past, due to the post-colonialism's emergence as a valid school of criticism. However, the horror and sci-fi aspects of Frankenstein have overshadowed this theme and have become the dominant cultural conversation of the book. An example of how Frankenstein has changed over time to make the post-colonial overtones specifically more prominent is an alteration to Henry Clerval's ambitions in the 1831 edition. Henry Clerval is a childhood friend of Victor and Elizabeth, for anyone who hasn't read the book yet. He is murdered by the monster when Victor destroys the monster's female companion. Below is an extract that explains what happens in the 1831 edition and why it was changed.
This is a note on the text from the 2000 edition of Frankenstein. Henry Clerval's eager curiosity and desire for travel in the 1818 edition is directed more specifically in the 1831 version towards becoming a colonial administrator.
Due to technical difficulties, we could not find a picture of Henry Clerval, so please settle for this picture of James McAvoy and Daniel Radcliffe. Thank you. Structure and form.
Narration.
Embedded narration. The embedded narrative of Frankenstein, with 3 separate narrators, offers a post-colonialist viewpoint, as it is not just Frankenstein's perspective that we get, but also the monsters, who traditionally would not have been given a voice.
The unreliable narrator. Frankenstein, representing the colonist, is unreliable in the fact that he tries to disguise his maltreatment of the monster and blames fate for the results of his poor decisions. The monster, representing the colonized, is also unreliable due to his lack of status as a human and part in committing crimes. The picture at the top is another modern interpretation of Frankenstein, but as we all know, Frankenstein doesn't have a bride.
Continuing on from that incisive point, Christopher Kraft suggests Gothic 19th century fiction has a 3-part structure. The text first invites or admits a monster, then entertains and is entertained by monstrosity for some extended duration, until, in its closing pages, it expels or repudiates the monster and all the disruptions that he/she/it brings. Now, this is taken from Christopher Kraft's book called Kiss Me With Those Red Lips, which sounds like a Taylor Swift lyric, and that's my attempt at a joke to pep this up. Please please enjoy the pictures below.
Intertextuality. The structure of Frankenstein gives the character space to interact in a sometimes anarchic way, giving rise to potential progressive criticisms. Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights is a Gothic novel with a similar structure to Frankenstein. In this, she encloses the anarchic rebellions of the characters against the established order. We are as confused as this Frankenstein adaptation guy because, like him, we have not read Wuthering Heights.
If you are wondering why our attempts at comedy have rapidly increased, it is because this is getting more and more boring. Now, please enjoy our section on language and some quotes from Frankenstein and our analysis.
In Chapter 5, Frankenstein says, "For this I deprived myself of rest and health. I desired it with an ardour that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart." This could allude to hopes of a colonizer who wants what they see as savagery fixed, but has done more harm than good to the world. One could ask what drove him to become so obsessed with becoming a necromancer that his desire to create life was put ahead of his own personal needs.
In Chapter 7, Frankenstein says, "A flash of lightning illuminated the object, and discovered its shape plainly to me. Its gigantic stature, and the deformity of its aspect more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon, to whom I had given life." This statement echoes a colonizer seeking power over a population they are afraid of by dismissing them as savage.
In Chapter 10, the monster says, "All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us." The colonialist view on this is that the monster believes he is wretched because that's how society sees him. He believes he should be hated and will act like a true monster by doing bad things if Frankenstein does not follow his wish. As we learnt in Shakespeare, thou is a rude term. It shows the monster's contempt for Frankenstein and his uncaring actions. Ties have a connotation of slavery. Frankenstein has acted like a slave owner in his lack of responsibility towards the monster.
In Chapter 11, the monster, here offering a post-colonialist perspective because he is given a voice, says, "Some attacked me. I longed to join them, but dared not. I remembered the treatment I had suffered the night before." Here, the monster is gaining identity and breaking free from the mother country, but in a negative way, because it's a step not rooted in self-discovery, but rather in self-protection. It has to escape the oppression it has felt from its colonizers. This negative necessity could explain the monsters and the wider colonized population's aggression towards the colonized. It's not due to the innate savagery they are assigned, but rather the label put on the savage and the self-fulfilling prophecy that it gives. The monster could also represent a colony, making a monster the colony, and all of the characters that interact with it and reject it the colonizers, which could show Shelley's intent to communicate that much of the population at the time Frankenstein was written was complicit in allowing colonization to happen when it indulged the savage stereotype that was so widely spread throughout the media.
In Chapter 16, the monster says, "I am alone and miserable. Man will not associate with me. But one as deformed and horrible as myself would not deny herself to me. My companion must be of the same species and have the same defects. This being you must create." Here, the monster has internalized the savage narrative and believes itself to be ugly. This correlates with the feminist theory of self-objectification, internalized messages that result in isolation and depression. It also shows how women were placed last in colonies. The monster looks for power in dominating a female of his same kind. He says, "Deny herself to me," which has connotations of sexual assault. The repetition of must shows that the monster is in control of the situation, so trying to become free from the colonizer and prejudiced.
In Chapter 20, the monster says, "Was there no injustice in this? Am I to be thought the only criminal when all humankind has sinned against me?" Here, the monster speaking shows the guilt of the colonizers for their savage crimes.
In chapter 23, Frankenstein says, "I would sell my life dearly, and not shrink from the conflict, until my own life, or that of my adversary, was extinguished." Here, there are slavery connotations when he says sell my life, and there is also a colonial attitude towards death when he says extinguished, which is a euphemism. Theories. The feminist theory. The destruction by Frankenstein of the monster's unfinished wife shows the experience of colonized women, who were seen as disposable, only useful for sexual and reproductive purposes. The fact that she is aborted basically shows the subjugation of women in colonies and how they can only provide men with sexual and reproductive favours. The psychoanalytical theory. Post-colonial explanation of the self-fulfilling prophecy of the savage. Colonizers labelled the colonized as savage and rejected them from civilized society, and so the colonized are aggressive towards colonizers, but not due to innate savagery, rather as a reaction to their rejection.
Our psychoanalytical and feminist combined original theory that relates to post-colonialism. In our original theory, which we kind of made up so we don't know if it's actually right, as illustrated by this failed GIF below, we see the colony as the id, the colonizers as the ego, and the repressed females as the superego. And this is in an imperialist society. So the destruction by the colonizers and the rebellion against this by the colonized that is caused by an imperialist society could represent the results of the id and ego interacting without the conscience of the superego, which could be the repressed feminine in this equation. Frankenstein is the rational neuter, and the monster is the masculine. Applying this theory to Frankenstein, Shelley, possibly influenced by her mother's proto-feminist teachings, could be saying that the imperialist nations and their colonies cannot succeed without the education of women, which was key to Wollstonecraft's teachings and their involvement in society. This would mean, appropriate to a time when post-colonialism did not exist, that Shelley was not necessarily against colonialism, but her work may read this way as she attempts to criticize the treatment of women in colonies. Well, that's what we think anyway.
Charles Bresler said in an introduction to Theory and Practice, post-colonialism encompasses a study of literature written in countries that are or were at some point colonized by England or some other imperial power. Frankenstein is set in the North Pole and in countries all over Europe that were colonizers or not colonizers at the time. Ultimately, we think that post-colonialism isn't the main reason for the diverse setting, is in fact of the theme of escaping, as the monster and Frankenstein always, run into each other. From Bresler's perspective, Shelley could not have been a post-colonialist, as none of Frankenstein is set in former or current colonies. This fits with our theory that Shelley was not criticising imperialism, rather she was criticising its treatment of women, a theory which is consistent with the context we know about her and her upbringing.
Another critic, Bartolomé de las Sazar Greenblatt, apologies for the pronunciation, said, "There is no man or race not considered barbarous with respect to some other man or race." This criticism fits with Frankenstein as it accurately describes the feelings between Frankenstein and his monster, how they interact and how they see each other.
Spivak says in A Woman's Text, "In this overly didactic text, Shelley's point is that social engineering should not be based on a pure theoretical or natural scientific reason alone, which is her implicit critique of the utilitarian vision of an engineered society." This could be Shelley's critique of imperialism in English culture, and the way it disregards the natural and the feminine as savage. This links with our theory, as we have implied that Shelley may have no issue with an imperial society, rather what she takes issue with is how the society neglects women. Below is another failed gif of our fave guy Benedict Cumberbatch, and with this, suddenly what we thought was the civilised has now switched, so you could say the real violent character is revealed. Motifs and symbols. In the top right hand corner is a picture of Frankenweenie, which, if you haven't watched, is about having a companion. This goes against the theme of isolation, and doesn't really have anything to do with our motors and symbols. But anyway, the monster as a symbol. From classical times to the Renaissance, monsters were interpreted either as signs of divine anger or as signs of impending disasters. If the monster's appearance is a visible warning, it is essentially a warning against the foolishness demonstrated by Victor, so we can establish that although the monster is horrifying, it is only the vicious behaviour of human society that makes the monster violent himself. Otherwise he could be more humane and natural.
Another motif or symbol, whatever you want to call it, used is nature. The weather showing the monster's feeling could be a colonial interpretation, because in Frankenstein we see the weather echoing how the monster feels, as he is showing him to be emotional, which shows savagery as the civilized are rational, as discussed earlier in what the civilized represent. The weather connection again reinforces this, as it is a natural phenomenon as opposed to a scientific phenomenon, which is what the civilized represent. A post-colonial view is that the fact that Frankenstein also has connections to nature. In terms of emotion, this shows that humans are innately connected to nature, and the colonizers denying this, because they want to deny what they see as savagery, is a fallacy. So Shelley may be saying that as much as we try to disconnect ourselves from our id, we are all still savage, and we all have that innate connection with nature. You can kind of see it from this another failed gif. It's Benedict Cumberbatch, and he performed in a play of Frankenstein, and on alternate nights he and another actor took in turns playing both the monster and Frankenstein. So we've kind of screenshotted it so that you can see him half as Frankenstein and half as the monster. And we think this kind of links to the themes, because it's all about personal identity and how people see themselves. So let's talk about otherism. The creature is seen as an other of society, and he says, "I found myself similar, yet at the same time, strangely unlike the beings whom to conversation I was a listener. I was sympathized and partly understood them, but I was unformed in the mind. I was dependent on none and related to none." He also says, "The path to my departure was free, and there was none to lament my annihilation. My person was hideous, and my stature gigantic. What did this mean? Who was I? What was I? Whence did I come? What was my destination?" Now, the monster saying all this shows him being othered by society, which is something we've discussed when we looked at Orientalism by Edward Said. This creation of the other, which also represents the savage, by the supposedly civilized in society, detaches them from what they see as wrong or strange or bad, but it fails to recognize the similarities between the civilized and the savage. So that's why we put the GIF there, because we thought it represented how actually, even though this whole imperialist system tries to create massive gaps between the supposed civilized and savage, they're actually quite similar, and this is why otherism is a false concept in the imperialist system.
Religion. Victor says, "The rain was pouring in torrents, with thick mists, still I would penetrate their misty veil." Here Victor sees himself as God. This is how he embraces nature and yet does not see himself as savage, like the monster, as it is not what he is victim to, it is what he controls. Essay extract example. This is an essay extract example from York Notes, and the question is, some readers have commented that Mary Shelley presents the monster as more human than his creator. How far do you agree with this view? So I'm not going to read it, I'm just going to pick out the AOs. So AO1 is in blue, AO2 is in orange, AO3 is in green, and AO4 is in red. So the first goes into the orange. The picture I present to you is peaceful and human. This is AO2 and is a good quotation to start the essay and lead into the topic. The next one is an AO1, and this engages with the question and is a strong, clear argument. Then there's the AO3 with the critical reference, and then the AO4 in the second paragraph is a good range of contextual references. So, talking about William Godwin. So overall, this essay extract example would be part of an A grade example. What is good about it is it has a clear focus on the question with no waffling, and of course further in they would analyse some language, but it's already detailed, and it doesn't stick to just one AO, they're evenly distributed throughout the answer. This is another essay extract example by Jake Reynolds, and the question is, to what extent do you agree with the view that the humans in Frankenstein are more monstrous than the monster? So again, we start with the AO2 with the good quotation to start the essay and lead into the topic, and then the AO1 which engages the question, and then this is the point which is backed up by the AO3 critical references. And then the second paragraph has more critical references and context in, as well as more AOs. And so this would be another A grade example, because again, there's a clear focus on the question, and it's very detailed, and again, it doesn't stick to one AO, it is evenly distributed throughout the answer.
Thank you for watching. We hope you didn't find this too dull, but hopefully it will help with your revision. And we couldn't find a GIF to agree on, so here is a picture of Frankenstein, I think very appropriate to the PowerPoint. Anyway, thanks for watching.